So glucose only becomes abnormal when you've been sick for multiple decades, right? I had an A1C of 4.7, which is completely normal, and I was insulin resistant. 6 years ago, I actually suffered a heart attack.
Dr. Cooley, how did you find carnivore?
Good morning, Dave, and thanks for the opportunity to chat with you and your supporters. I am a conventionally trained cardiologist and electrophysiologist, so I specialize in a subspecialty of cardiology called cardiac electrophysiology, which is heart rhythm treatment. So most of what I do relates to treating people who already have problems with an arrhythmia disease state. And so I, as part of that, I do preventative treatments with patients, but I also do interventions. The interventions that I do are ablations and device implantations. Ablations are procedures that identify sources of arrhythmia and then apply an energy source to try to get rid of that source. And devices include pacemakers and defibrillators. I also, I think because of my own personal journey with a cardiac health problem, so not only am I a cardiac physician, but I'm also a cardiac patient. I have a major emphasis on helping people not only prevent all cardiovascular diseases, but better manage them. And so I have a primary focus on preventative treatment and lifestyle treatments. And so 6 years ago, I actually suffered a heart attack. It's, in medical terms called a STEMI. And it happened while I was exercising. And what I'll tell your audience is that I thought I was living a pretty healthy life, doing all the right things. And I won't go into too much detail about that STEMI, but thankfully, I was treated quickly, received a stent in the culprit artery. And I did not suffer significant heart damage. So my heart function is good. And the walls that were served by that artery are moving just fine. So I was very fortunate. But that was a major wake-up call. And I've always known that I have risk. My family history is quite troubling from a cardiovascular standpoint. My father had a heart attack when he was 35, had bypass that same year, and then did what most cardiologists tell patients to do, and he was pretty strict. And I'll go into some detail about that because it relates to how I lived my life, in my 30s up to age 52, which is when I had that heart attack. And he unfortunately had some additional interventions, over the ensuing years, and then unfortunately had sudden death at age 58. And he was the longest surviving male Cooley that we looked at, dating all the way back to the potato famine in Ireland. So every male died early from cardiovascular disease, heart attacks and sudden death. His father before that I think he was in his 40s when he died of a heart attack. And so I sought the help of a cardiologist around the age of 30. And what we learned was that my lipids were relatively, unremarkable in my eyes, but also in their eyes. And I think, and I don't blame, any one person or any entity for that matter. I don't blame modern medicine. In fact, I'm alive because of modern medicine. But there were definitely some holes and some blind spots in both myself, but also my physicians taking care of me. And I was put on a statin because I was felt to be high risk from a genetic and a family history perspective. And I was basically told that, my family history is bad and it's genetic and there's not much I can do except try to live a healthy life, which really meant don't smoke, try to manage stress, exercise regularly, and eat in a Mediterranean, low-fat, low cholesterol way. And that is what I did. And I was pretty good. I didn't eat much red meat. I avoided eggs, especially the yolk. So I avoided high cholesterol foods, but I didn't avoid sugar. I tried to avoid combinations of sugar and saturated fats, but I wouldn't say I necessarily avoided sugar. And now know that I am and was a sugar addict. And my lipid profile actually is interesting. It always showed rather modest LDL. My triglycerides typically ran about 150. My HDL cholesterol was low, and that was really something that every cardiologist eyeballs were on. And the remark was always the same. It was, oh, that's a genetic problem. Low HDL, which was sometimes in the 20s and 30s for me. When we finally had the opportunity to do a little deeper analysis, looking at lipofractions, I was a type B LDL pattern. And so for your audience, that's a lot of small, dense LDL particles. And then a little bit later, found out I had Lp(a) elevation, which is still considered a genetic lipid defect. And I do test positive for an Lp(a) gene variant. And I'm happy to dive as deep as you think we should in this interview about some of these things about what exactly is Lp(a). But there definitely there definitely is genetic lipid risk in myself. But I think, now in retrospect, what was missing was the impact that my lipid profile, the impact of the metabolic signature on my lipid profile. We now know that is metabolic dyslipidemia, right? That's high LDL particles, not necessarily terribly high. My LDL typically ran around 100. So not necessarily high LDL cholesterol concentration. And I think it's important for your audience to know that when you do a standard lipid profile, you get an LDL-C, which is a concentration. It's calculated. It's not a particle count. And so there are people who have discordance between the concentration and the particles. You can have a relatively modest concentration, but have a high number of particles. And that's going to be a much different risk profile than somebody with a higher concentration, but fewer particles, right? So if you took somebody with an LDL-C of 100, they could be 100 particles each with a low amount of cholesterol concentration in those particles, 1 milligram, or they could have 10 particles with 10 milligrams of cholesterol. Very different scenarios, but they have the same LDL-C, right? And so that's kind of what I did for 30 years, really, is I just took a statin. And on that statin, my LDL-C and my ApoB, which is a reflection of, ApoB is a protein that gives lipoproteins their signature, and it's a proxy of all of the potentially atherogenic particles, ran in the 30s to 40s, right? That's super low. And it's at a level where cardiology would say CAD should be an orphan disease, right? And I think that this is where modern cardiology has a major blind spot, because there's this tendency to look at a single biomarker of risk, LDL, and ignore the context that it exists in, the context of the entire individual. And I think that, I'm a great example where that's just a big failure, right? I mean, I had 20 years of LDL, of lipid levels when you're focusing on LDL and ApoB at a level where I should not have had the problem I had, right? Now, I already identified that. I've got an additional risk in the Lp(a). But I think when you make the mistake of just focusing on a single biomarker and not the context, you really miss a massive remaining risk. You just do. And I think one of the biggest drivers of that risk, but also risk of many chronic diseases, is metabolic health and the presence or absence of insulin resistance. And so when I had that, the other interesting thing in my history over those 20 years is that I probably had about 20 stress tests. My cardiologist was very proactive from the standpoint of stressing me, and almost on a yearly basis, he would say, we need to do another stress test. You're very high risk. And I would have stress echoes. I mean, it wasn't just treadmill stress tests. It was, good stress tests, and they were never abnormal. I always passed them with flying colors. And I did exercise quite a bit. I did a lot of weight training, did a lot of aerobic exercising, shifting in later years towards more biking because of some knee problems, but did a lot of exercising. I actually had a normal stress test 2 weeks before my heart attack. Yeah. And so that's another major, I think, point to bring out, is that stress testing, is a functional assessment. It has value, but it has limitations, right? It's not direct imaging, and it was never recommended that I have direct imaging. I think at that time, the CAC scanning was relatively new, at least not, hadn't sort of entered into the mainstream. It wasn't on most cardiologists' mind. When I had the heart attack, I recovered. I started regaining my strength back. Started getting back into exercise routines, and Brett Smith, who you had on your podcast a few weeks ago, was somebody that was very helpful to me. Maybe not exactly in the beginning, which is a kind of funny story, but ultimately I opened my eyes and listened, and became more curious. And that's a driving philosophy for me going forward here, is to really try to stay curious and interested and intrigued by clinical observations. And so we have a long history of playing tennis together for many years, and then we both kind of transitioned to a few other sports, but all racket sports, pickleball and paddleball. But so one Saturday, I believe it was, we went out and played pickle together, and I told him my story, and I had shifted to a whole food plant-based diet right after the heart attack. So one of the big things I did was completely eliminate sugar. I continued to be very low fat as part of that, but I definitely eliminated refined, ultra processed sugars. Well, I eliminated junk food. And Brett said, "What are you doing? That's crazy. I'm not going to help you." And I said, "Wait a minute. You don't know what you're talking about. I'm a cardiologist," right? So I threw the appeal to authority argument at him, and he didn't take that. But this went on for a few weeks, and I basically kind of said he's crazy and ignored him. And then my wife encouraged me to see another physician, and I saw a lipidologist, and she was a cash only lipidologist. So I went in, and it was the first visit with her was a 4-hour visit, and she went through all my records and all my labs, and at the end of the 4 hours, she basically said, "Your problem is insulin resistance. It's not genetics, and I'm going to prove it to you." And she didn't necessarily push me in any dietary direction, at that point. But she did a Kraft test, which is a oral glucose tolerance test with insulin measurements, and it was completely abnormal. I had a fasting insulin level of 17, and this was, keep in mind, this was several months after my heart attack. This was several months on a whole food plant-based diet. I weighed 150 in college. Now, I was a collegiate athlete, so I was engaging in a ton of exercise, but I was pretty lean, 150. I wouldn't say I was very muscular. Back then, they didn't have tennis players lifting too much weights. Getting bulky as a tennis player was not a thing. But I was lean, and over the years, I had kind of ballooned up to about 185. So I was overweight, but I wouldn't say I was obese. And I lost probably 20 pounds, just getting rid of the sugar, just eating better. What I thought was better from a cardiovascular perspective, a whole food plant-based diet. Now in hindsight, what I will say about that diet is that for me, it was miserable because I was hungry all the time. But I didn't really appreciate that until I changed to a ketogenic diet. Now I know, and I continue to kind of work. I'm always working on the diet, and always working on things that optimize my lipidome, that keep my asthma and psoriasis in remission, which was a chronic problem on my mixed standard diet and whole food plant-based diet, and give me the most energy and mental clarity so that I can maximally engage in life. I'm always working on these things. It's a never-ending process, and for me, it's kind of a never-ending battle. But when I did that test, I was 20 pounds lighter, and I was still pretty floridly insulin resistant, which to me is amazing. And my lipid profile was unchanged on that diet, really. In fact, some of it was worse. My HDL was low. My triglyceride was still high. And when I had my heart attack, my triglyceride to HDL ratio, which is a marker of your metabolic status, was about 3. And my LDL, because I was taking that statin still, my LDL was still suppressed, right? And the NMR profile of that still showed type E pattern. In fact, it was worse than ever. And so based on that data, she convinced me to do a ketotarian diet, which is what I very quickly transitioned to. And at the same time, Brett and I continued to have conversations, and I just really appreciated his view. And like I said, I didn't press back as much as I did in the very beginning with our conversations about it. And I really sort of, as I started to dive deep into the literature about metabolic health and insulin resistance and just cholesterol and heart disease, I sort of saw the light. And now that diet is really sort of morphed. I still eat in a way that keeps me in a state of nutritional ketosis. I don't know that I feel I always have to be necessarily, but I eat predominantly animal proteins, but I still do eat vegetables, non-starchy vegetables. So I'm not strictly carnivore, but I'm carb controlled for sure. I eliminate sugar. I don't eat seed oils, and I don't pay a lot of attention to the types of fats I eat. I do just naturally lean towards probably just a mix of poly and saturated fats. I love dairy, so I still eat dairy. I don't fear saturated fat because the mechanism by which saturated fat can potentially be problematic doesn't seem to impact any of my biologies or biomarkers. I'm not insulin resistant, and I think the association of saturated fat with insulin resistance is just simply related to the fact that higher saturated fat diets tend to associate with higher carbohydrate diets, right? So if you're carb controlled, low carb, and eating saturated fats, I don't know of any data that shows that that's going to cause a problem from a metabolic perspective. And so I am someone, though, because I have food addictions and I have food noise and intense cravings, I don't trust myself. And for a couple of years, I kind of allowed some diet creep to occur. And I've had, different stressors, in my life that have come and gone. And the last year has been particularly tough for me from a stress perspective. And I don't manage stress well. It's something that I really try to, I'm really trying now to focus on better. Before I sort of go into the impact of the last year on me, let me just backtrack a second. So on the ketogenic diet, which again is largely animal based, and I think that I use vegetables because I'm very concerned about nutrient and energy density, and so I am now in a point where I really focus on satiety per calorie, and this is a model that is out there. People can see this on social media. There's the website dietdoctor.com, which has kind of an offshoot called HAVA, And there's Marty Kendall with Optimizing Nutrition. And these are sources of this model. And right now, that's my thing. I like this model. And Marty has a nice graph that shows what macronutrient percentages correlate with the highest diet quality. And that's something I'm currently following. And for me, it just works. And I think you can apply this to really any dietary tribe you want. You can apply that to a ketogenic diet. You could apply it to a vegetarian diet. I don't think that there's anything that, you can't sort of, what you can't take any, you can take any matrix diet and apply these principles, where maximal diet quality is achieved with a protein percentage around 40, carbohydrate percentage around 10 to 13, and a fat percentage around 20 to 25. And when I hit those metrics, I'm dialed in. I mean, I feel really good. If I want to lose weight, and right now, because I put on 10 to 15 pounds, I'm trying to shed that. It's super easy. For the last 5 days, for example, I've had about 1,300 calories per day, which is low for me, but my protein percentage is 40%. So I don't feel like I'm at jeopardy for losing lean tissue mass, and I don't feel hungry doing that. I feel lots of energy. My food noise and cravings are super low. And I just feel it's a really good strategy. Now, when I get to the weight I want, what I'll do is maintain those percentages, but just up my calorie probably a little bit so that I'm not continuing to lose weight. But I went a couple of years thinking, counting calories, tracking macros, tracking what you eat is just a pain in the rear. Who the heck wants to spend time doing that, right? But I think, and this, I don't want to generalize to everybody, but for me, I need to do that. I need something to hold me accountable. I need a goal that I can have in my rear view mirror and always be striving for. But if I'm just left to my own devices, my fear is that I and many people will probably start to experience creep, right? Dietary things will start creeping in that you don't want or that are not optimal. And I don't know if it's human nature or what, but so I'm putting a plug in for Hava. It's super easy. You just take a photo of your food, and it's really accurate in logging that, and it's super convenient. But that's been working for me. But so on this dietary approach, being in ketogenic, and I use a breathalyzer to sort of keep myself honest. I have a fasting insulin of 1. So it went from 17 to 1. My HDL went from 20s to 30s up to high 60s, even in the 70s at times. My LDL my LDL-C stayed about the same, but I shifted from type B pattern to type A pattern. And my triglycerides are in the 50s, 60s. So I've flipped my triglyceride ratio to less than 1. And so to me, those are biomarkers that all indicate that, I'm doing well metabolically. Now, interestingly, despite that, I actually had another cardiac event a week ago. I had done well for 6 years. Nothing happened. Exercising quite vigorously, perhaps too vigorously, with weight training and biking. I had a little lapse in biking because I moved and I was living, bought a house that was only a few blocks from the hospital. So to me, it wasn't worth biking to work every day, which is what I was doing in my previous job. And so I would walk to work, but I wasn't biking as much. And then I ended up selling that house, and then moved a little bit further away, which then became a 30-minute bike ride. So for the last month and a half, I've been biking to and fro work every day. And I bike really hard. Like I go all out for 30 minutes. So it's like a 30-minute hit. A lot of oxidative stress. This is Brett's theory. Anyway, my cardiologist, thinks that this might be true as well. But a week ago, I was biking home. I have a tendency to not drink enough water during the day, so I do tend to get dehydrated over the course of the day, and sometimes I forget my water bottle. So I'm biking hard for 30 minutes, and here in Utah, it's 95 to upper 90s in the late afternoon, early evening even, and so it's hot. Sun's still out, and so 10 minutes into my bike ride, I got chest pain, and I stupidly continued to ride all the way home. And then thought that I would just, get inside, cool off and rest and see what happens. And it didn't go away. It wasn't severe chest pain like 6 years ago. But I was concerned enough because of my history. So texted my cardiologist and said, I'm heading in, I've got chest pain. And luckily he was, in the hospital taking care of somebody else there. So he met me in the emergency room, and again, I feel extremely fortunate, and frustrated at the same time that this happened, but I was not having a STEMI, and there was no evidence of heart attack. My enzymes in the blood were normal, but the pain was still there. It was kind of diminishing, but hadn't left yet. And, I took aspirin and I took a couple nitro even. And so he said, let's just go to the lab. And we went to the lab, and pretty much everything was stable. My previous stent was okay. No change there. That artery was stable. My circumflex artery was stable. My LAD, which is the main artery going on top, going over the front part of the heart, serves the most muscle. Had some old plaquing, which I knew about, which I think is stable. I still have to kind of go back and look at my angiogram images from 6 years ago and compare to this one. But he did an ultrasound of the artery and saw that one of the plaques had a flap, called it a flap. So to me, that just means that there was some rupture there. But I just thank God that, what I've been doing, I think has been good for me. That, there's been really no progression that I can tell at this point of significant plaque progression. But I had he said it was a very thick, fibrous cap, and it ruptured. This is speculation, of course, but, could it have been the high aerobic activity, dehydrated, hot outside, sheer force that ruptured this thing? And I'm again just thankful that despite that rupture, it didn't thrombose, which means clot off and cause a massive heart attack. So I'm very thankful that it wasn't worse. Every time I've had an event, I think that it could have been worse, right? I could have died. And I got a stent in that area, and I feel really good. I'm back on the bike, but not quite as vigorous as before. But now, now I'm left thinking, okay, what do I do? I don't think I'm overall that unique, but I definitely there's some uniqueness to me, but right. And I know a lot about myself. I know more about myself than most people do, for sure. Right. I mean, I've had very detailed lipid analyses. I know my metabolic problem. I've rectified that. I know my genetics. I've got multiple gene variants that impact how I live my life. I've got 2 obesity genes. My father was obese. I think your audience probably can tell from what I've said, what works for me in managing that aspect is keeping carbs restricted, and optimizing protein. I still incorporate vegetables. I'm not, like I said, I'm not completely carnivore because I don't think that vegetables bother me. And, when you look at plant proteins versus animal proteins, they're always going to look better in studies because they inherently have more fiber. So from a satiety per calorie perspective, they will win, and they're less energy dense. So that means they will also win from a satiety per calorie perspective. But when you think about what people are mostly eating in the animal world, it's junk, right? And so I think that if you look at animal protein intake when it's humanely raised, grass-fed, grass-finished, and you're not incorporating that in a matrix of other unhealthy things, I think your animal proteins are better.
How does all this square with the job that you have? Because I haven't seen many cardiologists online that talk about you should go animal based and things like that.
Well, as I said at the start, I'm an electrophysiologist. But what I very quickly realized, and around the time that I had my first event, I started to navigate the world of lifestyle modification because there were studies coming out about the impact that obesity had on atrial fibrillation, which is one of the most common arrhythmias that I treat. And so I was beginning to start to engage patients in conversations about weight management for treatment of their atrial fibrillation. Like, okay, let's not just do procedures to try to rectify. And what I noticed and what I became frustrated with and actually led to burnout was that despite what I thought was good work and doing good things for patients, they just kept coming back with problem after problem after problem, sometimes worse than they were before. And as I started to think about how I cared about what I was seeing in clinical practice, and what happened to me, I very quickly realized that this is a root cause problem. We're not addressing root cause. And so that's something that no matter who comes to see me, I will dive into, right? So if somebody comes to see me with new onset atrial fibrillation, I will start to tell them and evaluate what are the root causes here. And we will do deep dives, and I will explain that, let's say, and it's typically a very consistent theme. Most of the patients that I see have a weight problem, have metabolic problem, and you can just look at their biomarkers and you can tell. I mean, and I think, another problem I also adopt things that I think that help me identify these root causes and that help me treat patients better than most. Because another blind spot of modern medicine is that it is looking at biomarkers that only pick up disease at the end stages. Take diabetes, for example. I mean, this is just classic. Over 90% of healthcare providers measure fasting glucose and A1C. Those are glucose-centric biomarkers. They will only become abnormal after you've been sick for multiple decades, right? So imagine that. Your diabetes type 2, let's just ignore type 1 for now, is insulin resistance on a spectrum, right? It's just a spectrum of insulin resistance. But you don't manifest the cut points, which are arbitrarily defined. There's a whole nother I could spend an hour on the problem of cut points. You don't become cut point defined diabetic until the end stage, till your body can no longer homeostatically regulate glucose. So glucose only becomes abnormal when you've been sick for multiple decades, right? I had an A1C of 4.7, which is completely normal, and I was insulin resistant. And so imagine how many people are out there where an A1C is done or fasting glucose is done, and the doctor says, you're fine, no worries, but you're sick as all get out. You are metabolically abnormally regulated, and it's driving everything. And so I will do fasting insulin and glucose. I don't do a lot of the oral glucose tolerance tests because I find this sufficient. And I've been now tracking, I've been doing this for a couple of years now, and I'm tracking this data. And I will tell you that I haven't completed it, but right now, way over 90% of patients that come in, this is a unselected AFib population, are insulin resistant, right? And it's also very common to diagnose coronary artery disease in someone coming into me with just an arrhythmia, right? So I have to have that discussion, and I have to look for other problems that may be lurking underneath the hood. And so that's my journey, along with my appreciation that I wasn't doing the best I could do for my patients, now has led me to practice this way, where I think I have much greater value. And luckily I'm in a healthcare system that values that doesn't put a premium on an RVU, which is a dollar figure for a service, but on the interaction and the real important outcomes. So I can spend an hour with a patient. My patient visits don't have to be 5 minutes, right? And when you're dealing with lifestyle factors and start talking about exercise and stress reduction techniques and sleep, all the levers that you can potentially pull, nutrition, it takes time. People need to first be educated, and then you need to kind of develop a strategy to sort of help them navigate the changes that they ultimately would benefit from. If that hopefully answers your question. It has had a major impact on how I practice. And my goals are first and foremost helping people navigate lifestyle change in a very, very complex environment.
The patients that come in that hear, okay, well, you need to change some things about your lifestyle, you need to change some things about your sleep patterns and your eating. The people that do take it seriously, do they exhibit improvement?
Oh yeah, absolutely. There are definitely people who take it seriously and go all out and are very successful. And there's always going to be, even those people who are very, very motivated are going to have bumps in the road, and we learn together on how to navigate those. And then on the flip side, there's definitely people who really struggle with change, and that's complex and very individualized, and there's many reasons for that. There's social norms that are disturbing and problematic. There's food addiction that's problematic. A lot of it is food addiction, and helping people just understand that. When I start to have a conversation, let's say I feel it's appropriate to have a conversation about nutrition with a patient, and I start to explain about some of the problems and some of the things that we've been told that may not be true. The very first response almost most universally is, well, I really love that, be it bread, rice, pasta, whatever. I can't give that up. That's like universal, right? So that tells you right there that it's just food addiction talking. So we talk a lot about that, and then try to come up with strategies to deal with that. It never goes away. I don't think. Maybe it does for some people. For me, it never really goes away. It's controllable. It's manageable.
Yeah.
I can suppress it, and that's a whole nother topic and complex issue about the hormones involved in that, and the interaction between our food matrix overall and our gut microbiome. And we're just touching the surface of gut microbiome.
What was the hardest thing for you getting onto a ketogenic lifestyle?
I would say that really it was more mental barriers than anything. It was so ingrained that to prevent cardiovascular disease, or to manage cardiovascular risk, that you should not be eating saturated fat, and that you should be avoiding high cholesterol foods, and that you should not be eating red meat. I mean, that's just so ingrained. And that Mediterranean diet is best. And now I realize that it's just not true, or it's just not true. None of it is really true. Saturated fat, can have an impact on LDL through LDL receptor regulation, but the impact is very minor. And I think even now in some publications, for example, I think the ACC has a document that now basically says that saturated fat is not a nutrient of concern, right? But it's still, I mean, you talk to most cardiologists, and that's what they're gonna tell you. And it's just ingrained, and I just don't think that many of physicians think more about it. Right? They're not doing deep dives on it and really getting in, and they're not seeing patients like myself too much who don't follow that recommendation anymore and are doing great. I mean, yeah, I had a cardiac event again, and you'll get a crowd that'll say, "Oh, it's because of his ketogenic diet," right? There's so much fear mongering around the ketogenic diet and the carnivore diet.
You just weren't statining hard enough.
Yeah. But and I don't want to throw my current cardiologist under the bus. He's a good guy, and like I said, modern medicine is glorious, but it's also a problem. And in all its glory, I think it's wonderful. It has probably saved my life, but it also missed the boat.
I think the problem is that everything, once you have medicine, like everything in life, whether it's products or whatever it happens to be, everything ends up getting seen as absolutes.
Yeah.
And as you alluded to at the beginning of the interview, it's all nuanced. But we forget that, right? Because we're just going, what's the button I need to push to fix this problem?
Yeah.
And that's where the issues come in, right?
Exactly. And that I like that you use that term, because that is an overriding philosophy of mine, and something that I take with me in every patient encounter is personalization and nuance. I get that there are issues from a public health perspective, but I just think that if we are going to turn this bus around, we need to be nuanced in our approaches. And so that's what I'm about. I do deep dives. I look at the entire lipidome. I look at the metabolic status. I look at genetics. We have a very easy cheek swab we can do in our office here that gives you an ASCVD and lipid risk profile. And it really does add a lot of value. But yeah, nuanced is really important, which kind of gets at that point of the problem of cut points, right? I mean, it's so funny that, you know, in the diabetic world, when someone goes from 6.4 to 6.5, now all of a sudden there's this big concern, and 3 pills are prescribed, right? But there's absolutely physiologically no difference in going from 6.3 to 6.4, which would generate no concern, right? Oh, you're not diabetic, don't worry. It's amazing, right? Our biologies are continuous. Our physiologies are continuous variables, and we have to message that better. These cut points can be really, there's a need for cut points from the perspective of organizing people into somebody with and without disease for scientific analysis, but they're also incredibly problematic, right? And this is one of the things that I rail against in the, you know, in the science surrounding cholesterol and its association with heart disease, is that when you are doing statistical analyses to deal with confounders, and you're studying a population and you separate out what you think is a disease state population and then a population without the disease to try to deal with the diabetic confounder, your population without disease is still diseased. So you've now just completely lost that ability to deal with that. And I think that's why we have some of the problems we do with the cholesterol science, is because everyone in those studies, regardless of being separated into diabetic and non-diabetic, is diabetic, because we know 93% of the population is not metabolically healthy.
Yeah. If the average of all the sick people is the average, then it's not a good average, right?
Exactly.
Mm.
So
yeah,
it's a major bias that exists in the cholesterol literature.
Mm. Yeah. So, Dr. Cooley, how can people reach out to you? I understand you've got a podcast starting soon. Is that correct?
Yeah, Brett Smith and I are starting a project. We think that there's still some value that we can add in the social media space. We think we have important messages. We think we can help people, you know, and when we do some deep dives in some of the literature, we can do some debunking of things. We can validate certain things, and we think we can help people extract the best information from social media sources. Our YouTube channel, I believe, is called The Metabochondriacs. We'll be doing an introductory video shortly.
No problem. Well, I'll link to that in the show notes. Dr. Cooley, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your experience with us. I really appreciate your time.
Very welcome. Thanks for the opportunity.